In the muddy trenches of the Western Front in 1916, a French soldier held a weapon that was supposed to save his life, but often ended it. It was the CSRG 1915, better known as the Chauchat. It is widely considered the worst machine gun in the history of warfare. The reputation of this gun is so toxic that nearly a century later, it is still the punchline of military jokes. Soldiers claimed it jammed if you looked at it wrong. They claimed the parts fell off when you fired it. They claimed that it was safer to stand in front of a Chauchat than behind one, because at least the enemy wasn't getting hit by exploding springs. But is this reputation entirely fair? Or was the Chauchat a victim of the First Industrial War, a misunderstanding of tactics, and a manufacturing disaster? Today we are going to perform a mechanical autopsy on the Chauchat. We will strip it down to its springs and screws. We will analyze the bicycle factory that built it, the fatal flaw in its magazine design, and the American conversion disaster that sealed its fate. To understand why the Chauchat exists, you have to understand the panic of 1915. The war was supposed to be over by Christmas, but it wasn't. The German army had dug in. They had thousands of heavy Maxim machine guns that mowed down French infantry like wheat. The French army had a problem. Their heavy machine gun, the Saint Etienne, was a complex, heavy, tripod-mounted beast that couldn't move during an assault. They needed a weapon that could move. They needed walking fire. The concept was simple. A soldier would walk across no man's land, firing a machine gun from the hip to suppress the enemy heads until he reached the trench. To do this, the gun had to be light enough for one man to carry. It needed to be automatic. And most importantly, it needed to be cheap. Enter Colonel Louis Chauchat. He was a brilliant engineer who had been working on automatic weapons since before the war. He proposed a design that used a long recoil system. This is where the mechanics get strange. In a standard gas-operated gun, like an AK-47, the barrel stays still while a gas piston moves the bolt back. In a long recoil system, the barrel itself unlocks and moves backward into the receiver along with the bolt. When you fire a Chauchat, a heavy chunk of steel, the barrel and the bolt assembly slams backward towards your face. Then a massive spring pushes the barrel forward, while the bolt stays back to eject the shell. Finally, the bolt flies forward to chamber the next round. It is a violent, clunky, and slow mechanical dance. It feels like holding a jackhammer or a pogo stick against your shoulder. Because of this massive moving mass, the rate of fire was very slow, only about 250 rounds per minute. For comparison, a German MG-08 fired at 500 rounds per minute. The Chauchat sounded like a slow, rhythmic chug, chug, chug. But this slowness was actually a feature, not a bug. It made the gun controllable. A soldier could fire it while walking without the recoil knocking him over. The problem wasn't the concept. The problem was the factory floor. The French armories were already at maximum capacity building rifles. So, the contract for the Chauchat was given to a company called Gladiator. Gladiator was not an arms manufacturer. They were a bicycle factory. They were used to stamping out cheap sheet metal for bicycle fenders, not precision-milled steel for automatic weapons. The resulting gun was a collection of loose tolerances and cheap metal. The receiver was made of heavy-gauge tubing that looked like plumbing pipe. The pistol grip was an uncomfortable piece of steel sticking straight down. The bipod was flimsy and spindly, prone to collapsing in the mud. But the most critical failure, the one that killed the crew, was the magazine. The Chauchat used a 20-round detachable magazine shaped like a half-moon. It was awkward to carry and difficult to load. But the engineers at Gladiator made a design choice that defied all logic. They cut large open windows into the side of the magazine. The idea was practical on paper. The gunner needed to see how much ammo he had left. The windows allowed him to count his rounds. But in the reality of the trenches, these windows were portals to hell. They were funnels for mud, grit, and water. The Western Front was a sea of liquid mud. When a soldier crawled through a trench, the open side of the magazine scooped up sludge like a shovel. This mud was pushed directly into the gun's action. The grit acted like sandpaper on the moving parts. The Chauchat's long recoil system relied on friction being low. The barrel had to slide back and forth smoothly. When you introduce mud into a system that relies on a sliding barrel, the gun stops. Instantly. Soldiers reported that the gun would jam after the first 2 or 3 shots. They spent more time kicking the bolt open than firing it. A machine gunner who cannot fire is a priority target. He draws enemy fire because of his weapon, but he cannot suppress the enemy to save himself. This is why the gun killed its crew. It made you a target, but failed to make you a threat. Despite these flaws, the French manufactured over 260,000 of them. Why? Because they had no choice. It was the only portable automatic weapon available in 1916. But the story gets worse when the Americans arrived. In 1917, the United States entered the war. They arrived with almost no heavy weapons of their own. They had no tanks, no artillery, and no machine guns. General Pershing needed weapons immediately. The French offered to sell them the Chauchat. The Americans bought 16,000 of the original French versions chambered in 8mm Liebel. These worked poorly, but they worked. But the American Ordnance Department made a fatal demand. They wanted the gun converted to fire the American .30-06 service cartridge. This was an engineering impossibility that they forced into existence. The .30-06 round is significantly more powerful than the French 8mm. It generates higher chamber pressure and has a different case geometry. Converting a bicycle-part gun to handle a high-power rifle round was suicide. The result was the Model 1918 American Chauchat. It is widely regarded as the worst specific firearm ever fielded by the US military. The chambering was done incorrectly. When the gun got hot, the steel of the chamber would expand differently than the brass of the American casing. The empty shell would get stuck in the chamber. The extractor would rip the rim off the cartridge, leaving the case jammed inside the barrel. To fix this, the gunner had to take a cleaning rod and hammer the empty shell out from the front, while under fire. It was a disaster. The American version jammed so frequently that many units simply threw them away. There are reports of American doughboys trading their Chauchats for standard bolt-action rifles, preferring to have a slow gun that worked than a fast gun that didn't. Inspectors found that 40% of the American Chauchats were defective right out of the crate. Some couldn't even fire a single shot without failing. This cemented the legend. The American soldiers went home and told stories of the Chauchat gun that was made of junk and got their friends killed. However, we must look at the counter-argument. Was it really useless? In the hands of the French army, the original 8mm version actually served a purpose. Experienced French gunners learned how to keep it clean. They learned to wrap canvas around the magazines to keep the mud out. They learned to oil it constantly. Used correctly, the Chauchat provided a massive volume of fire that allowed the French to advance in 1918. It changed infantry tactics forever. It was the first true assault rifle in terms of tactical doctrine. It bridged the gap between the rifle and the stationary machine gun. When the massive German spring offensive hit in 1918, it was lines of Chauchat gunners who helped slow the assault. The failure was not entirely in the design. It was in the expectation. It was a cheaply made, mass-produced tool thrown into the worst conditions imaginable. Compare it to the Lewis gun, the British equivalent. The Lewis gun was fantastic. It was reliable, accurate, and well-made. But the Lewis gun was expensive. It took skilled machinists to build. It was heavy. It cost 5 times as much as a Chauchat. France couldn't afford 5 times the cost. They needed 200,000 guns now. The Chauchat was the solution to an economic problem, not just a military one. It represents the cold calculus of industrial war. Is it better to give 200,000 men a terrible machine gun, or to give 20,000 men a perfect one? France chose quantity, and while individual soldiers suffered for it, the sheer volume of fire helped win the war. But the engineering legacy is undeniable. The long recoil system was a dead end for shoulder-fired weapons. It creates too much vibration. The open magazine was a mistake that no other gun designer ever repeated. It remains a textbook example of good idea, bad reality. The bicycle factory origins show the dangers of lowering manufacturing standards for lethal weapons. When you hold a Chauchat today in a museum, it feels flimsy. The parts rattle. It feels like a piece of stamped farm equipment. But you also feel the history. This piece of pipe and spring fought in almost every major battle from Verdun to the Argonne. It is a reminder that in war, good enough is often the standard, even if good enough gets people killed. The ultimate humiliation for the Chauchat came after the war. The French army replaced it as fast as they could. They buried them, scrapped them, or sold them to unsuspecting nations. Meanwhile, the Americans, scarred by the experience, spent the next 20 years developing the BAR, Browning automatic rifle, to ensure they never had to rely on foreign junk again. The BAR was everything the Chauchat wasn't: heavy, machined from solid steel, and utterly reliable. But the ghost of the Chauchat lingered. It taught military planners a lesson about logistics versus reliability. You cannot field a weapon that requires a clean environment in a war fought in the mud. You cannot ask a bicycle maker to build a machine gun without strict quality control. And you definitely cannot cut holes in the side of your magazine just to see the bullets. So, was the Chauchat a death trap? For the untrained American soldier with a bad conversion model, yes. It was lethal to the user. For the desperate French poilu in 1916 holding off a German charge, it was a lifeline, however flawed. It was a gun that worked 60% of the time, which was 100% better than having no gun at all.